theory of Fed independence, despite how much Volcker's own banking policies in the 1980s do not confirm to that account. Bernanke was motivated less by the lessons of the 1980s and much more by the specter of the 1930s. In words of David Wessel, author of one of the definitive accounts of the crisis told largely from the perspective of Bernanke's Fed, Bernanke resolved to do whatever it took to prevent a repeat of Great Depression from happening. Bernanke, both as an economic historian and as a central banker, changed the exercise of emergency lending and in the process changed the discussion of what exactly the Fed would do as a last resort. Volcker wasn't the only one to express dismay in the Bernanke Fed actions. Public opinion of the Fed dropped from its historic highs, and Ben Bernanke became the least popular Fed to gain reappointment in the Fed's history. As measured by the breakdown in votes on his Senate confirmation, the Fed's emergency actions also changed the relationship between the Fed and the public, recognizing the Fed's loss in prestige. Bernanke launched in 2009 a full-court press of news conferences, televised, revised interviews, and town meetings, and other general functions, and other general public outreach. And everywhere he went, he was faced with the hostility over the use of the Fed's lend of last resort function, lender. I'm as disgusted by the bailouts as you are, he told one town meeting. Nothing made me more angry than having to intervene, particularly in a few cases where companies took wild bets. After those tumultuous decisions placed the Fed's central bank functions back in the public eye, the questions immediately followed as Paul Tucker, a scholar and former central banker, put it in the underlying theme in legitimacy, how to ensure that the central bank's role as a lender of last resort is legitimate in a democratic societies where powers and responsibilities have in effect been delegated by the elected legislator. Critics have focused on this question of legitimacy in two ways, both of which draw erroneously on the Ulysses Punchbowl account of Fed independence. The first is so much power to make these kinds of decisions should not be in the hands of a single individual. Representative Barney Frank, a staunch defender of the Federal Reserve during the 2008 financial crisis, is often associated with this view. When Bernanke and Secretary of Treasury Henry Paulson approached Congress in the fall of 2008 about the need for new legislation to inject $85 billion into insurance giant AIG, Frank asked if the Fed had that kind of money. Bernanke responded that he had $800 billion. Frank was stunned. He can make any loan he wants under any terms to any entity or individual in America that he thinks is economically justified. Frank later said, "No one in democracy unelected should have $800 billion to dispense as he sees fit." Frank wasn't exactly right, of course. As we saw in Chapter 4, Ben Bernanke needed to convince at least 4 others on the Board of Governors and the relevant Reserve Bank each time the Fed invoked the emergency authority under Section 13.3. But it is true that the Federal Reserve System had this extraordinary power that Bagot would have recognized and applauded. Reflecting the discomfort with so much emergency power, the Dodd-Frank Act revised this emergency lending authority. After Dodd-Frank, the Federal Reserve Act now requires that emergency lending was to be targeted to a single individual company, but to any participant in any program or facility. with broad-based eligibility that is gone are the days where Bear Stearns can show up with liquid collateral and receive individual loan through the emergency discount window. Such funds have come to through a broader program that aimed at more than a single institution. There is a second criticism against the Fed's emergency lending. This is essentially inconsistent with the first. Rather than make emergency lending authority more subject to political control, a second set of critics argued that the Fed's crisis actions eroded the Fed's independence because it brought the Fed into such close decision-making with the Secretary of the Treasury. Superficially, this argument makes sense. During the crisis, it's unquestionably true that Bernanke and other central bankers at the Fed worked cheek by jowl with Paulson and others at the Treasury, and Tim Gethner was the embodiment of that proximity, switching in 2009 from being the vice chair of the Federal Open Market Committee as president of the New York Fed to Obama's Treasury Secretary. There is no question that during the Obama administration, Gethner and Bernanke were close. We would talk constantly. Over the next few months, Gethner wrote about his time as a new Treasury Secretary, basically a never-ending conference call, making sure we stayed on the same page, preventing nervous colleagues from pulling us back towards inertia. As he put it more directly elsewhere, I doubt there's ever been a closer relationship between a Treasury Secretary and a Fed Chairman. This proximity wasn't only during the Obama administration. Even at the beginning of the financial crisis in spring of 2008 with the Fed sponsor and J.P. Morgan Chase's acquisition of Bear Stearns, the Fed seemingly unilateral actions to be a lender of resort occurred in tandem with administration policies. Bush Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson was apprised of developments as they occurred. Paulson was a principal negotiator of the terms of the ultimate transaction. When the rest of the financial system teetered over the edge, the Bernanke Fed and the Paulson Treasury paused their triad strategy and sought and received congressional participation in the Troubled Asset Relief Program, TARP. Became one of the most controversial pieces of legislation in recent American history, spawned the resurgence of right wing of the Republican Party, and has led arguably to the country's inability to govern its fiscal affairs credibly and consistently. Despite all of the above, the coordination compromises independence. Critique its Exhibit A, and the damage that Ulysses Punchbowl view of the Fed independence can wreak on understanding the Fed and its functions. There is simply no serious argument that the Fed Treasury should have pursued distinct crisis policies, and a strong argument that working against each other would have been harmful. As one scholar and former central banker put it, think of waking up in the morning after the Lehman Brothers failed. For example, should Ben Bernanke not have taken Hank Paulson's call? Whatever the virtues in the building institutional barriers between the Fed and the presidency to prevent coordination of monetary policy with fiscal policy, it cannot apply when the government is picking winners and losers. In the financial market, precisely the Bernanke Fed and the Bush and Obama administration did during the 2008 financial crisis. This fundamental reality is truth. That is not altered, even if we accept that it was necessary to starve off a complete collapse of the global financial system, nor is feasible. That decisions are removed entirely from Fed's orbit, in part because the Fed's ability to move quickly in the crisis is what makes the central bank a viable lender of last resort in the first place. The best answer then is some kind of balance. It is exactly for the reason that Bernanke and Paulson sought not to use the Fed's emergency lending authority without congressional approval, even though the Federal Reserve Act would not have allowed them to do so, and Congress seems to have appreciated in its way. This kind of fiscal monetary coordination and invocation of emergency lending now requires approval by the Secretary of Treasury. That politicians and bankers coordinate policy in as a crisis has strong, if often forgotten basis in history, including the 1907 panic that many presume lead to the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913. While many member of J.P. Morgan is the savior of the financial system, the reality is that Theodore Roosevelt's Secretary of Treasury, George Cortelyou, was in constant contact with the New York bankers, and not just by telegraph. The Roosevelt Treasury pointed up tens of millions of dollars of public money at no interest, so staunch in the flow of funds out of New York. The incredibly delicate decisions about who succeeds and who fails in the financial crisis require exactly the kinds of judgments that are best made with some kind of political participation. The changes that occurred through Dodd-Frank reflect that sensitivity. These two critiques that the Fed should not wield as a lender last resort authority alone, and the Fed worked too closely with the Treasury, and thus compromised its independence, can't both be right, but they do illustrate how difficult it is to make sense of Fed independence through the Ulysses Punchbowl lens. Under that standard account, the Fed is insulated by law to allow it to focus on price stability, an area where politicians will be predictably terrible if left to their own electoral devices. Ironically, that lens works poorly to explain the Fed in what is eponymous role as a central bank. The Fed is in the central bank because it is a central bank. The Fed is keeper of the Central Reserve, the lender of the resort, the one in the crisis to guide the financial system to safety. It is precisely here where solemn demands to respect Fed independence can be most confusing, misleading, and harmful. The Fed is a regulator. A brief history of bank regulation in the United States. The Fed's roots as a central bank include its role as a lender of last resort. The same could be said about the role of the Fed as a regulator, but not without a few caveats. That is, the Fed was already a regulator of sorts. What was changed over a century and accelerated after the crisis in the expansive scope of its regulatory portfolio. The portfolio has expanded dramatically. Even when the Fed has failed at significant portions of it, the bank regulation was a different animal in 1913 than it is in 2016. At the time of the regulation of banking effectively, the regulation of the Federal Reserve banking function, who could qualify for what kind of participation in the Federal Reserve System? The focus was on the reliance of the participants in the banking system, what we have all come to call microprudential regulation, a regulation that focuses on the safety and soundness of specific institutions. This rather isolated focus from within the Federal Reserve, deflected is unusual. Perhaps unique nature of this bank regulation in the federal United States. In the United States, sovereign authority is deposited in both the states and the federal government, with vague overlapping authority between two spheres. After the failure of the Second Bank of the United States in 1836, the country entered an era when banking developed almost entirely within the states. After the Civil War, the federal government entered the fray again through the creation of national banking system and national banks organized under federal law and regulated by awkwardly named and still open for business office and computer comptroller of the currency. Commercial banks, after passage of the two National Banking Acts, could choose between regulated by their home state, which gave them more liberty to transact a wide variety of business, or as a national bank. The national banking system was not particularly national. There were significant restrictions on interstate and intrastate banking during the entire period. Although these regional banks are correspondent networks, and they built a quasi-national system. The politics of banking regulation during much of American history depended on hard limits on these networks to prevent them from merging into single national institutions through significant political influence in state legislatures. The U.S. Congress and the White House state bankers were able to impose limits on the expansion of banking activities across the state lines. These limits significantly influenced the development of the U.S. banking system, including the ways the Fed would eventually interact with that system. This was a regulatory context when the Fed was founded. The Federal Reserve Act introduced through the Federal Reserve Bank's 12 new banking entities whose primary purpose was to regulate the ways that private banks, whether organized under state or federal law, could receive cash payment. For the securities they presented to the Federal Reserve Bank in banking lingo, what they would receive when they brought their paper for discount. After the Great Depression, Congress made several significant changes to regulatory landscape. By 1932, 25% of all the banks had failed, following the lead of some clearly state adopters. Congress introduced deposit insurance, a mechanism for preventing future panics. To regulate the Federal Insurance Fund, the Fed created the Federal Deposit Insurance Company, FDIC, funded not by a congressional appropriation but from an exaction from the Federal Reserve Banks. The Banking Act of 1933, better known as the Glass-Steagall Act for its sponsors Carter Glass and Henry Steagall, also created a new institution within the Fed, the Federal Open Market Committee, FOMC, consisting of the 12 presidents of the Federal Reserve, and it most famously ordered the division of commercial and investment banks. It also defined a new entity called bank holding associations or corporate conglomerates that included within the deposit-taking banks. For the years thereafter, the Fed had only indirect regulatory authority over the holding companies, the companies that had to receive board permission before voting their shares in member banks. Such permission carried with it some limited restrictions on the kinds of activities that such companies could pursue. But the Fed wanted more than Glass-Steagall provided. The Mariner S-list especially sought but did not receive more regulatory authority over these bank holding associations. Eventually, in 1956, Congress passed the Bank Holding Company Act, BHCA, to define and regulate what they had come to be known as banking holding companies. While the Fed took no official position on whether it could regulate these new financial institutions, the Fed became exclusive regulatory regardless. Then Chair William McChesney Martin was almost coy in the hearing that preceded the act's passage. When Senator Paul Douglas, D. Illinois, asked a single administering agency overseeing the act's new expansive powers should be, Martin was cool. We did not take a position on that. Senator Douglas pressed him. Is the Federal Reserve Board a receptive candidate for this? Martin, showing his skills at the hearing table and as a Washington insider, replied that the Federal Reserve Board would accept it, but we are not trying to make a grab for power here. Another senator piped in, you are not a candidate? Martin then took the risk. The board is not a candidate. Martin knew his audience though. The Congress put this Fed in the place as a regulator of banking holding companies, something S-list in all his enthusiasms for the role could never accomplish. Martin was also the better politician. Together with Glass-Steagall's prohibitions on commercial banks, the BHCA put the Fed in business of defining bank and the business of banking. The definitional authority would consume an extraordinary amount of regulatory and legislative effort over the 50 years following. And by the source of the Fed's over-expanding authority, as we have already seen in Chapter 2 regarding the Greenspan Fed's lack of interest in mortgage regulation, during roughly the same time Congress also questionably expanded consumer financial protection. Unlike the case of the BHCA, Congress did not give the Fed the exclusive regulatory authority over consumer financial protection. The Federal Trade Commission, for example, also took a prominent role. Nonetheless, the Fed saw once again a dramatic expansion in its regulatory function in a field that extended far beyond the business of discounting commercial paper and regulating bank reserves. After decades of the effort, the banks and their allies in the court cases, regulatory proceedings, and eventually legislation, Glass-Steagall died in 1999, and the lines between financial institutions started to evaporate. Bank holding company regulation, however, remained and remains a significant part of the Fed's regulatory function. After the 2008 financial crisis, Congress passed the Dodd-Frank Act, a sweeping overhaul of the financial regulatory state. Among the many innovations most relevant to our decision of the Fed as a banking regulator was the introduction of essentially a new regulatory function for the Fed and others within the government systemic systemic risk regulation. While the Fed had already been in the business of macro-prudential regulation, regulating the risk of common to the system as a whole, and not focused on the idiosyncrasies of individual firms, Dodd-Frank created a new institutional regulatory framework. Dodd-Frank's primary institutional innovation was the creation of the Financial Stability Oversight Council, FSOC, a council of regulators that includes 10 voting members of 5 non-voting members. The voting members include a Secretary of Treasury, who is the chair of the council, the Fed's chair, and the other banking securities. The financial regulators, the Fed is a first among equals on this council. Dodd-Frank puts the Fed through, not in the council's chair, directly in the business of systemic risk regulation. FSOC can make any financial institution submit information to the Fed, register with the Fed, and most importantly submit to the Fed supervisory authority. Those institutions with assets greater than $50 billion need not to be banks. If they are designated systemically important, they too will fall under Fed supervision. 3 aspects of this history are useful in thinking about Fed's power and independence. First, Congress has given the Fed more and regulatory responsibilities in broader and broader areas of the financial system. It has, to be sure, sometimes trimmed the Fed's sails, as in the near elimination of the Fed's role as a consumer banking regulator, but the creation of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is an almost unique exception in the banking history. The trend from Congress has been the expansion of the Fed's regulatory bailiwick. Also, in the case of the BHCA and, for example, the Truth in Lending Act, it is not true that the Fed has always sought that responsibility. Why regulators rely so heavily on Fed is not exactly clear. The fact of the reliance, however, is the space within which the Fed operates. From a regulatory perspective, is constantly changing, almost in one direction. The second takeaway is that the banking regulatory space has long been, and still remains, utterly fractured across both federal and state governments. The dual banking system, which refers to the location of regulatory authority at both the state and federal level, is perhaps unsurprising given the nation's history with federalism and the political power that thousands of community banks have wielded throughout the U.S. history. But there is one more than that to do. There is one more. The federal government has created new uniform laws in a number of regulatory spaces. The communications and civil rights to environmental regulation to nuclear regulation in areas that the states were essentially pushed out of the virtue of the U.S. Constitution's Supremacy Clause preempted. It is the technical legal term. And while there have been some rather extraordinary instances of federal preemption of banking laws, state banking regulation remains alive and well. The third implication of the regulatory history recited above is that the way it changes our view of the Ulysses Punchbowl vision of Fed independence. Scholars and commentators have long said the Fed's independence is not important in regulatory matters as it is in monetary policy matters, but it is a central argument of the book that the Fed's structure of government sits atop all the Fed's policy, not just one. The formal and informal ways that the politicians and other outsiders influence Fed policy do not stop simply because Congress has given the Fed more than one responsibility under related. It is to mission to chaperone our monetary party. As we will see in Part 3, the mechanisms vary, but they are also comprehensive in the application to all the Fed's authority. For example, the Fed's unique budgetary autonomy covers monetary policy and regulatory policy alike. The members of the Board of Governors serve the same terms in their capacity as members of the FOMC. And as a bank regulators, the point is simply institutionally, when you pick up one end of the Fed independent stick, you pick up the other. Bank supervision. Some of the same issues are on display in another field of the Fed. Endeavor bank supervision. The words supervision and regulation are sometimes used synonymously, but they aren't the same thing. Bank regulation involves issuing specific rules that govern to quote one Fed overview, the operations, activities, and accusations of the banks of banking organizations generally, whereas bank supervision consists of monitoring, inspecting, and examining of these banks to access their condition and their compliance with relevant laws and regulations. In other words, the difference between making system-wide policy and implementing and enforcing that policy implementation is not bank supervision. However, a mechanical activity, it is a complicated process that involves two components linked, at least in concept. Chronologically, first a bank is examined on an individual basis to ensure that it complies with the relevant law, and second, if the examination reveals a failure of compliance, enforcement proceedings are brought against the bank. Both steps in that chronology have changed significantly over the years, but it is the role of the bank examiner that bears the most directly on thinking about the ways the Fed's policy-making space's power and independence is influenced by outsiders. When the Fed was founded in 1913, the practice of bank examination had been more or less stable for decades. O. Henry, the famous 19th century short story writer, described as a stylized version of the one bank examiner who cut imposing figure in the story Friends from San Rosario. Indecision had no part in the movements of the bank examiner, a Mr. J.F.C. Nettlewick, an unknown in the city where he came to conduct this business. The bankers were terrified of him. As the bank teller on duty prepared for Mr. Nettlewick's inspection, the teller knew it was right to the cent, and he had nothing to fear, till the teller was terrified anyway. There was something so icy and swift, so impersonal and uncompromising about this man that his very presence seemed an accusation. He looked to be a man who would never make nor overlook an error. In zero, Henry's retelling based in the part of his own experience as a blank teller in the 19th century, the bank examiner was someone to be respected and indeed feared. The world of bank examination has changed dramatically since O. Henry's time. These shifts reflect not only on a change in the sophistication of financial institutions, although those developments have clearly occurred, but it is also a change in the regulatory landscape described in the previous section. Whereas a Mr. Nettlewick could come to a distinct city and open the books to ensure that the balance sheet added up to leave by the end of the day, the bank examiners today have no such luxury. The sheer depth of complexity that afflicts bank balance sheets prevents even experts from discerning what banks owe and own, what they have sold and received, and whether they are compliant with the hundreds of banking statutes that form the architecture of modern bank supervision. There are a lot of problems with this level of new and ever-accelerating complexity in the supervision of banks, but the principal problem is that the bank examiners must also, by definition, defer more and more to the banks examined. Instead of Mr. Nettlewick striking fear into the hearts of bank tellers because of Nettlewick's comparative expertise, bank examiners in the 21st century must live with the reality that it is virtually impossible for them to know more about the bank than the bankers they supervise. Most bank examiners in that context will defer. Even those who push back aren't necessarily rewarded for doing so. In 2014, an example of this kind of problem in bank examination arose at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. After 2008 financial crisis, New York Fed President William Dudley, worried that his institution had failed as a supervisor. To understand how the failure had occurred, he hired a former banker and professor at Columbia University, David Beam, to do an exhaustive, unlimited access review of the New York Fed and its operations. In return, the report would be secret. The Beam report disclosed a culture that is too risk-averse to respond quickly and flexibly to new challenges, and bank supervisors who deferred to the banks they regulated in virtually every aspect of bank supervision, from developing and relying on internal risk management systems to deferring on banks' reactions to potential problem spots. The stated modus operandi of many bank supervisors was to avoid confrontation with the banks. This seemed a surefire way for the New York Fed to render itself complicit in fueling future crises. To Dudley's credit, the Beam report fueled efforts to change the New York Fed approach to failed supervision, but institutional culture changes slowly, if it changes at all. Following its recommendation, the New York Fed hired a new crop of bank examiners. Including one named Carmen Segarra. True to the new expectations, Segarra was vocal when she spotted failures to comply with federal law at Goldman Sachs, the bank where she was sanctioned. As an examiner in particular, she concluded that Goldman Sachs had failed to have a firm-wide conflicts of interest policy to manage situations in which the firm bankers would advise clients on decisions where those bankers had other interests advising the purchase of a company where the banker owned stock, for example. In some ways, the lack of a firm-wide conflicts of interest policy is astonishing. These conflicts have been at the heart of a series of Wall Street scandals throughout the 20th century. From the great crash of 1929 to the accounting scandals in the early 2000s, and yet this is what Segarra discovered and reported to her supervisors at the New York Fed. But her supervisors, with a few expectations, didn't share Segarra's enthusiasm for pushing Goldman to an exchange in practices, because Segarra was worried about all what she saw, and in case she needed to support a version of events in the future, she started to secretly record her conversations at the Fed and at Goldman Sachs. She ended up with 46 hours of recorded conversations, which ended when Segarra was fired. She worked at the New York Fed for a total of 7 months. As the news of Segarra's tapes, her accusations in the New York Fed's banking culture leaked to the press, deeply researched reports appeared in ProPublica, and a major feature was aired on the public radio program. The American Life reactions divided roughly along two lines. Defenders of the Fed and have said that Segarra's claims are inaccurate, overblown, and depend on cherry-picked quotes, and otherwise not reflected of the regulators' usual practices, and that her disclosures were themselves deeply unethical. Critics of the Fed have said that this is the New York Fed does. It has always been captured by the banks it regulates, and this proximity is part of the Fed's DNA, genetics. There are at least two sides of this story, and the Federal Reserve Bank of the New York has largely ceded to narrative to Segarra. It may be that there is more to her account than we know.